Welcome to the Back40 Leadership Podcast, Season 2, Episode 7. My name is Michael Bond, and I will be one of your hosts today. I'm sitting here with pastors Mel Massengale and Kendall Kersey.
Hello.
Greetings.
So today we're going to talk about the multi-purpose church, or churches that maybe could function as like community centers. So think of churches that offer a broader array of activities than just weekend worship or preaching or musical worship, that sort of thing. Churches that might offer like a 24-hour gym or a restaurant or other places where people typically gather. So we'll get into that. We'll figure out what, the nuances, the dangers, that sort of thing regarding that topic would be. But before we do that, I'd like to talk about this week in church leadership. And the article that I found for this was written by the son of a guy whose dad was a pastor. So his grandfather was a pastor. And so this guy felt called to ministry, and he tried to tell his dad that he was called to ministry. His dad told him one time, I don't want you to do it because I don't want you to be hurt. He said, I'll never say anything else again if you decide to go forward, but I'm just going to warn you one time that I don't want you to do it because I don't want you to be hurt. And so the guy tried to figure out like what that was about, because this guy who was called to ministry, when he thought of his church, he always thought of like healing and hope and like all the things that are the opposite of trauma. That's how he felt about his own church. He felt like he was at home there. But then I think as he was talking to his grandmother to try to figure out what was going on, he realized that his dad, being a pastor's son, was able to watch his own dad go through the sort of the shadow side of church, which he described as Darwinism and Machiavellianism, like the kind of cunning, political, sometimes corrupt air around things like business meetings, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so his dad's dad, like this guy thought very highly of it. It's kind of complicated because we're dealing with 3 generations here, but the guy who's called to ministry, his dad thought very highly of his dad. Mm-hmm. And so he thought that he didn't want his own son to be hurt by the church because he saw his dad hurt by the church. And so I think this applies not only to pastors and the children of pastors, but also to Christians who spend a lot of time around the church and get to see the more difficult, messy areas of ministry. And so what I'd like to talk about is like, do you have any experience with this kind of dog eat dog mentality that might surround a church that has like a big budget or like has to make big business decisions, and you have these meetings where people kind of cast the fruit of the Spirit aside and try to do what's in their own self-interest or something like that? And then how would you, for somebody who's been hurt by those things, like let's say the child of a pastor who's watched his or her dad go through that stuff, how would you prevent that child from having a view of the church that's like less than stellar because of what they watched their loved one be subject to by the congregation?
Well, let me start by saying I feel like this article, probably there's a false narrative that there's any hurt in church, because from my experience, there's never, ever been any hurt or backbiting or subversiveness, or I've never seen it anywhere. So
yeah, no one tries to overthrow leadership ever.
Wow. Yeah. It's very easy then, guys.
That's it. No. And I think you had said something about, big budgets, but the reality is this stuff happens in churches of 40, and sometimes I think it might be more likely to happen in a church of 40 than a church that has 2,000 in attendance, just because a larger church sometimes, the way the leadership is structured is it prevents some of that to some degree, as far as like board trying to take control, or one family that really, tries to dominate a business meeting or things like that. But I mean, the truth is that stuff happens in large churches and small churches, regardless, because human beings are messed up sometimes. In my theological point of view, human beings are messed up.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's limited to just big churches. I think it can, but yeah, I think a lot of people that listen to this, if you're pastoring a small church, you've probably experienced it. I've experienced it at our church, since I've been here, dealing with subversiveness and, staff that were talking to people or having ungodly conversations, immoral, kind of things. So yeah, it doesn't matter how big or small, or how big the budget is or small the budget is. It's just, to me, that's human nature.
Yeah. I don't know. I would default to you on this specifically since, I've never been a lead pastor, so I wouldn't know. But, even if you're not a lead pastor, you still deal with some, form of burden carrying and hurt that you can experience. And I come from a family who has a lot of pastors in my family. A lot. And so one of the things that I think would help prevent some of this hurt either being passed down to generation, or in this narrative of saying, I've seen too much and seen what it's done to my dad, and so therefore I don't want my son to be a pastor. I think what would help with this is if pastors were a little bit more open, especially with their family, even about like, this is what you will experience, or if you want to go into ministry, that's great, but here's what's going to happen. Because the reason I prefaced with, I have a lot of pastors in my family on both sides, mom and dad. I was never told once ever that this is a really hard job, that it must be a calling, or you are going to be, overly frustrated and you're going to give up because it's going to be too hard. The burden is too heavy, and, it has to be a calling and you have to do it by the power of the Holy Spirit. I don't remember there ever being conversations about that. Like, especially even when I was like, hey, I feel like I'm called to ministry. And that was like when I was a teenager. I had uncles and cousins and like grandparents who'd been in ministry, and no one said, hey, that's great and all, and I'm glad, but just so you know, this is what it actually looks like. Yeah. And I think we would do a great service to those coming up in ministry, whether they be in family or not in family, and kind of allow them not only to see what's going on, but to have a conversation about it. Because I would assume that this guy in the middle generation here, he might have seen his dad hurt a lot, but I don't know if there was any conversation about, hey, just so you know, man, those are people, and those people, they're bad. Like on the inside, we're all bad. We need a savior, and that's just a part of the fallen world we live in. And here's how I'm handling it, or here's how I'm praying through it, or something like that. I just think it would help if they were honest, in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And that's something, both of my daughters feel called to ministry, and I'm grateful for that. But that's one of the things, we've shielded them from the worst of the worst, but we pull back the curtains enough for them to see like, oh yeah, this is not easy. And there are hard times, and they know dad gets hate mail sometimes. And, people I love have left the church for idiotic reasons. And, like that stuff is painful. So like, we want them to see this is really what ministry is, because I think that's part of the problem. I think we get into ministry with the wrong expectations sometimes. We think, man, look at that guy. He preaches and everybody seems to like him. I want to do that. And then it's like, nope.
He gets to study the Bible and play golf all day. How awesome is that?
That's right. So I get it. I think part of my goal here at Summit has been like, hey, let's heal some of the hurts that our church has caused in the past. And we've seen some of that. Some former pastors and some former staff members that we've been able to reconcile with by just acknowledging like, hey, in the past, I know you were done wrong. I know some things happened and I can't fix that, but man, I would love to build a bridge. And so that's been fun to see. But the reality is, if you do ministry for any amount of time at all, it's going to be painful. There's going to be, it's not just difficult, deeply personal circumstances. And the reality is, if we as ministers don't allow God to heal our pain, we will transmit that to other people. And so it's really important for us to have the right mentality about it and the right perspective on it.
So both of you have kids. I do not. I am told that kids are very observant. And so when you have a situation where someone is ugly with you as a pastor, it sounds to me like what you're saying is you try to be intentional about communicating that to your kids to like at least make sure that they're not observing it without any kind of input from you.
Yeah.
Because I think that maybe the mistake is, well, if I'm a pastor and I have children and somebody in the congregation is ugly with me, if I just don't say anything, or if I try to like set it aside, then the child won't notice. And I think the feature difference between this guy who's called to ministry and his dad who's like, I don't want to see you get hurt, is that the dad observed a lot of things on his own and maybe came to his own conclusions about them. And so are you saying then that like you need to be intentional when like something comes up that maybe it's like iffy about whether or not a child should know about, you need to be intentional about telling them and kind of communicating that with them?
I would say just so my kids are very young, 7, 5, and 2. So like, I'm not telling them obviously anything that's going on. They haven't really observed anything. I can't communicate that to them. But one thing I do liken it to is there are many times where I, as a parent, get frustrated with my kids and I lose my temper and I yell or, whatever. And what I have made it a point to do is that if I yell at them, if I raise my voice and it makes them cry and I tell them, go to your room, whatever, I come back up after we've both calmed down to their room and I say, hey, I'm sorry I yelled. I shouldn't have done that. You also should not have done what you did, but can we forgive each other? Let's talk through this. And so like, even though there could be possibly hurt there and it could be observed, like if I just let it go and just said, go to your room, and the last thing that they heard me do was yell at them and then they came back down and we just never talked about it again, that would instill more hurt than when we actually get an opportunity to talk about and say, hey, daddy, lost his temper. You lost your mind because you weren't listening. So like, let's work through this. Let's talk through this. And so that like, I hope to, at some point when they're old enough and they observe some things that might go on, that we have opened up those lines of communication to say, hey, this is what you saw, or this is what has been happening. It shouldn't be happening, but it is. And here's how we're going to handle it. I'm going to choose to forgive. I hope that you choose to forgive, and I hope that they choose to forgive, and let's all move forward. So that's the only perspective that I can speak of it from, because my kids just aren't old enough yet.
Yeah. Yeah. My girls are older. They're both, one's in college, one's in high school. And so they've seen a lot. But like I said, we try to be careful never to bring church baggage home. But I also pretty intentional about, if I come home and I've had a rough day, I don't want my girls, I'm honest enough with them that they know, like, man, I had a rough day. I had some really hard conversations today, or, there's a family in the church that's dealing with this and it's just weighing on my heart tonight, so, I want them to see that stuff. And then when they press a little bit about, hey, why did this happen? Or, hey, I'd noticed this. I just have to use discernment about, okay, how much can I share? Because it's not about, I think if we're not careful, pastors, we're looking for allies, and sometimes we don't have very many. And so it's easy for pastors to dump our junk on our kids and be like, everybody's against me and the board hates me, or whatever the problem is. And that's where the problem comes in. And that's where I think sometimes kids can build up a resistance to the things of God, because they see what their parents are dealing with. And so for me, I want to use discernment. I want to be careful. I want to make sure my kids aren't the place that I'm sharing and, building allies, that kind of thing. But at the same time, when they ask a question, I'm as honest as I can be while still guarding their heart. And it's a fine line to walk. And I've probably overshared about some things at times, but like I said, my girls both feel called to ministry, and they both like the church, and they both love Jesus, and they both think Kim and I are okay. So like, that's where it's like, okay, that's a win, somehow. So I don't know that there's a perfect right or wrong. I think you've got to figure out your kids and your family. I mean, because the same is true with your wife. It's different for me because Kim is on staff here, so she sees what I see for the most part. But if your spouse is not working at the church, you've got to use discernment. It's easy to go, well, this is my spouse, I'm going to share everything. Well, it might not be best for their heart to hear everything that's been told to you. So you've got to use discernment about how do I protect and how do I shield. And so it's just, it's tricky.
And I'm still learning that part too about the spouse thing is because there's sometimes when the reason I am frustrated or my temper is short is because I've dealt with so much stuff, within ministry or just dealing with the burdens of people, and I'm carrying that and haven't voiced it to anybody. And so I have to remind myself, oh, well, I need to tell my wife, oh, this is why I'm a little on edge today, or this is why I'm more down than what I really should be, is because I'm carrying this burden, or this is the issue that came up today, or whatever. So I'm still learning that.
Yeah. So the author of the article thought that articulating the distinction between church and Jesus was helpful when it comes to the bad side of church. But obviously we want people to associate the church with Jesus when it comes to the good side of church. Like, we want people to love the church. And so do you try to make that, do you try to articulate that difference, or how do you walk that line? Because we don't want people to look down on the church, to like kind of say, oh, well, church is terrible, but God is good. But at the same time, you do want that separation between both pastors and God and the church and God. Like, we don't want anyone to use like a human as a surrogate for God, or even the church as a surrogate for Jesus. And so do you spend time, how would you walk through it? Like, not even just with your kids, but with people in the congregation, to kind of prep them in case they have that toxic atmosphere show itself to them, that they're not like, oh man, the church is like this, God must be like this. Do you try to make that difference? Yeah,
I think it comes with authenticity. Like, you have to, from the top down, essentially, in your volunteers and your leaders and everybody, really pastoral, everybody from the top down has to be authentic and understanding, and really communicating with the way that they live, with the way that they communicate, that church is made up of broken people. The pastoralship is made up of broken people. We are all in the same boat, so to speak, with the fact that we have to have Jesus, and that, church, while it is Jesus's bride, it is not a perfect representation of who Jesus is. And so I think it's absolutely important that we draw that line, and that we make it very clear with being authentic. For instance, one of the things that we strive to do within our young adults ministry is that we tell real stories, like stories that we're not even over yet. We're still going through it. And we've made it a point to make sure that we're super authentic within that ministry, so that there isn't, and we create space for that too, to communicate that, so that there isn't this hierarchy of, oh, that person's more holy and look at them and they're on the pedestal. It's, hey, we're all in the same boat, and some of us have the privilege to preach, some of us have the privilege to sing, but we're all still here in the same boat, also in need of Jesus. And this ministry is made up of broken people who are seeking Jesus.
I think Disney lied to us, and for a generation of people that were raised on Disney, we think that solutions are happily ever after, and that people are either heroes or villains, that it's very clear cut. And the reality is we're all kind of King David, and we're all kind of King Saul, and so I think helping like my kids, helping our staff, helping our leaders understand that there's nuance, that people can do really horrible things. And that doesn't mean they're irredeemable. That doesn't mean that they're evil. Sometimes people just do stupid things. Sometimes people do dumb stuff. And so that's a position I have to take as a leader, just for my own heart, just to discipline my own heart, so that I don't, because it's easy to caricaturize people and go, oh, well, they did one bad thing, they are evil. And that's what happens in our society and our culture. And so when we have a narrative like this, it's important for us not to paint ourselves as the heroes and our abusers or our whatever opponents as the evil one, the antagonist in the story. So, I mean, that's something that even when there's been some challenging things that I've talked my girls through, or even our staff, there's been a couple situations where we've had to sit down with the whole team and go, hey, here's what's happening. Here's why it's happened. One of the things I'm always real careful about is to never go, hey, this happened because this person's bad, because that, again, it makes me feel better, because if they're bad, I must be good. But it's like, no. It's not because they're bad. It's because they made a bad choice, and we love them, and we're for them, and we believe in them. But, here's what's happening. So I think adding nuance to that really helps differentiate even between, hey, Because, that idea of I love Jesus, but I don't like the church, that drives me crazy because it's like, I like Mel, but I hate his wife. And it's like, well, that doesn't make sense. You got issues with me if you got issues with my wife. And so that's where if we add nuance, it makes it easier to go, okay, I'm not always in great relationship with people in the church because there's problems, but I love the church and I love Jesus.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's a major issue with that mindset especially in like millennials down. Like my generation down is very much, I love Jesus. Jesus is great. But everybody who follows him and the church and even the word of God, I don't like. I just like Jesus. I mean, that is a absolute problem. And it's because it comes from that. No one understands nuance in that.
Well, and I mean, I think that this is a topic for another podcast on another day, probably, but like the topic of deconstructionism is huge, among theologians and wannabe theologians and all that. And I think that's part of it, is that we have robbed the gospel of Jesus, or robbed Jesus of the gospel. We've separated these two things out. And it's like, you can't separate Jesus from the word of God. You can't separate Jesus from godly community, but yeah.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be the case that poorly managed expectations on behalf of a person who claims to have been hurt by church might have been the cause even more than actual tribulation in the church. Like someone walking into it thinking and having an inaccurate understanding of church could result to the church hurt rather than even just the tribulation inside the church. Because any amount of tribulation inside the church is going to cause church hurt if you're going into it thinking that the church is pure as the driven snow, Right. And so definitely that's good. Okay, so the multi-purpose church, or church acting as like the hub for community gatherings. This is an interesting one because there's difficulties here that seem relatively plain as day, and there's also like possibly big upsides. And so the first question we can maybe break into this with would be, do you think that churches are too focused on musical worship and preaching for every non-weekend gathering? So for instance, if you have a gathering, you try to gather people together through the week, do you think that there's too much of an emphasis on the format of like the weekend service and maybe just changing the format of the weekend service a little bit to accommodate the weekday gathering of whatever that is? Do you think pastors and leaders feel like they have to do some kind of preaching or some kind of worship in a gathering? And do you think that that's a problem that they feel that way?
So I would say the purpose of the church is to worship God, and that can go through music and to learn about God, preaching, teaching, and then to equip the saints. Like that's the purpose of the church on a weekend gathering or a gathering, right? But I think that other gatherings that are happening outside of just the weekend specific, I think, yes, some people would think that we have to worship and we have to pray and we have to read our Bibles and preach and teach every single time we come together. I would say that I don't think that's the case. I think that we reserve that for weekends, or we reserve that for specific worship services or specific teaching times, and that that having a multi-purpose throughout the week, it would be awesome. I think that's a great idea, honestly.
I think I've been part of churches where when I was on staff, the pastor was like, "Hey, we're going to do this. We're going to do this cookout for the 4th of July. We're going to have worship at the beginning." It's like, what? And yeah, we're going to have 3 worship songs. Why? Well, because we're gathered together. It's like, okay. And so here's the thing.
Then it's awkward for everybody.
Yeah. So if it's purposeful, if it's like, here's the reason why we're going to do it, then it might make sense. But I think sometimes we fall into a rut. We fall into a routine where we go, well, this is the way we do it. This is what we do. So I don't think it's necessary. I don't think we do a lot of stuff as a church where we don't even, in our community, for our community, like our egg hunts, we don't even preach the gospel. We don't, because I've been part of churches that did that too. Hey, we're going to do this free outreach, but when you get here, we're going to preach for 15 minutes to you. And it feels like a bait and switch. It feels like, hey, we're going to serve you, but we're going to subject you to this, and I get it, but for me, I just feel like, have a purpose behind what you do, and whether you are preaching the gospel at every event, that there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but if it's just because that's what we do and we're not going to change, that's problematic.
Well, I think people get comfortable too with, we know how to do this. We
Absolutely.
Honestly, I think that there are pastors that maybe don't know how to just communicate freely within a group and hang out at a cookout.
Yeah.
That I'm more comfortable with the microphone and speaking, but not necessarily more comfortable in a group talking to the people that I'm supposed to be leading. And so we just, we get comfortable in what we do, and we say, well, this is how we're going to do it,
Yeah, I agree. And I think if we can be more engaging in different ways, talking about multi-purpose, I think that's really valuable, really helpful.
Yeah, so the inspiration for this kind of thinking is, and I'm interested to know whether or not you think this is true, it looks like there might be an analog between the brick and mortar shopping mall and the brick and mortar church. And so when I say brick and mortar church, I mean people who are attending church physically in person. It's not there yet, but more and more it's getting to the point where you can experience churches are trying to build community into their online experience. Like that's what the interactive chat is about. That's what all this stuff. It's trying to be built in, and maybe we don't have the technology to fully achieve that yet. But we can certainly deliver a pretty good musical experience with the right virtual mix, with the right, if the person's listening with the right headphones or speakers on the other end. And I mean, we've been preaching messages online at churches. Have been doing that for a while now. And so the analog between the shopping mall and the brick and mortar church is that shopping malls have had to resort to setting up things like coffee shops and 24-hour gyms and places where people can go to gather for something that they just can't get online. And kind of, you said equipping of the saints. That's interesting to me because for some people, I've seen so much benefit to them out of going to a gym or going to something like that. That's been really edifying for them in other areas of their life. And so do you think that when we think about equipping of the saints, do you think we sometimes get hung up on teaching Bible rather than thinking about the other areas of their life where they might benefit from some other kind of activity that they could do? Do you think that the churches who are trying to build more of an online audience in the same way that Amazon has built an online shopping audience, do you think that the churches should start opening gyms, restaurants, things where people have to show up to be a part of that thing, because those things happen to also be edifying, those activities? And what are the dangers of that if that's something that churches start doing?
I love the idea of doing more than just a service at your church. I love the idea. Any church that I've been a part of, where I pastored at, I've always kind of wished and hoped that, man, it would be awesome if we could have a coffee shop that people just came to all the time here. And not just a coffee shop, but I've also had the idea of the gym thing, everywhere I've gone. That's something that I'm really passionate about. And I'm like, man, that'd be super sick if we could have a gym here that people could come to and just make quote unquote people come to the building, and just being at the building kind of creates almost a habit of going. And it's I wonder what they actually do on the weekend, or, it opens up more possibilities. Or there was a church on the move in Tulsa that they had a massive youth ministry. I think it was called 180 or something like that. Yeah. They had massive youth ministry. And one of the coolest things that they had was they had this major multi-purpose building just for youth that was it had tutoring in there. It had after school, kids could get dropped off there by the buses, and they had a basketball league, or they had, again, tutoring or something like that was actually
a half
helpful.
Pipe in their building.
Yeah.
It was crazy, all the stuff they had.
It was insane, but also really stinking cool, because they had opportunities. They were creating opportunities to have real conversations with students, instead of just come to Wednesday night and come and hear what we're doing. Instead, they're actually serving the community and creating opportunities for one-on-one conversations. So when you say, can we do something that maybe benefits them in another way? That's not just let's sit down and teach the Bible. I think that if, as pastors or as a church or as lay leaders or whatever, if we're doing our job, if we are doing it properly, then we should be, honestly, like, our words and our deeds, our actions, the conversations should be laced with the Word of God anyways. And I think that we don't have to sit down and preach a 3-point sermon or do a specific Bible study, but that there's going to be conversations that come up where the gospel is talked about, or where a specific life stage is talked about. How do I work through this or whatever? And the more opportunities we can create for that, the better.
And I think it's about intentionality too. What are you trying to do with this? There's a pastor up in Dayton who's a friend of Back40 that, they opened a coffee shop. And it was intentional. It was, hey, we want to reach people who aren't coming to church. We want to create a place for our community. And, so Pastor Kenny they're doing a good job, and they're trying to do some things differently. And so there's intentionality behind that. Over in Spring Church, PA, Pastor Terry Jones is the pastor of the Rock over there. And they have a people drive by and it doesn't look like a church, but you get inside and it's like, nope, it definitely doesn't, because they have a donut shop and they serve pizza and they have a rock climbing wall. They have a fun center there. And so it's opened, certain nights of the week, and people can come in, and that's their mindset behind it is, hey, it can be a revenue stream for the ministry, but really it's an outlet for us to minister in our community. We're filling a need in our community. So when it's intentional, I really like it. When the intention is outreach, when the intention is reaching the lost, I really like it. My problem with this is when it becomes more about insulating our people from the need to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
Like, hey, let's create an environment where our people can, they don't have to be subjected to,
We basically have a commune.
Yeah. It is a classy cult, anyway. But yeah, and so that's my problem. And I think that's easy to do. And the intention behind that, even, I don't think is ungodly necessarily, because they're like, hey, we want to create something for our church. But I've seen churches that have had bowling alleys and, that they've built in their building. And the purpose wasn't necessarily for outreach. The purpose was primarily for, we want to create something for our people. And that's where it's like, oh, it makes me a little uncomfortable, because it feels like we're getting off mission, to reach lost people, when it becomes more about just serving. And really, that's the danger. When our focus becomes more about serving the people within the church than it does about serving the people outside the church, that is the beginning of the end for any church, no matter how big or small or how big your budget is. So I think it's smart for churches to have multiple revenue streams. I think it's smart for, just like, wealth experts will talk about people having multiple revenue streams. I think it's good if a church can have multiple revenue streams. It helps protect you from a downturn in the economy or a downturn in giving. Or one family who's a heavy hitter decides to leave your church because they don't like your sermon, it helps insulate you from catastrophic events like that. But I think, you and I were talking about this, Michael, the other day. I know churches that became landlords, and that's dangerous, because you're going to evict people? Like, that's what you want the community to know, is that you evict a family. You know what I mean? Even if you're totally justified to evict them. And so, like, there's things I would say be real careful about what you do or how you do it. But in terms of just servicing your community, I think it's great.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that you can be intentional about that, not everybody has the opportunity to do this, but it'd be cool, I think, in an ideal world, to maybe even open up those particular different revenue streams or whatever. So you said a gym or a coffee shop. One of the things that I've had a thought of on campus here in Indiana is actually like facilitating a free laundromat for students specifically. But we wouldn't do that at the church. That would be dumb to do it at the church. We would need to do that on campus somewhere, or, a center that, like a coffee shop that's more for studying, that has more seating than the current coffee shop we have here in town. Like doing that kind of stuff. But that needs to be, again, on campus or near campus. And so the way that I think about it is, if a church is going to do that and be super intentional about, we want to reach other people outside of the church, then you could do it away from your church building and still make it work. There's a church near Pittsburgh that actually just bought a building that it's basically the same parking lot, but they do barbecue. And I visited them there, and it's not overly churchy. They don't have, it's called Holy Smokes, but outside of that, like it doesn't have any kind of like, you know, Christianese meat, you know, they're not selling Bible Belt brisket or something like that, you know? So they're not marketing it that way. But the atmosphere is just different. Like it's nice to go in there. It's the people that you're talking to you, they're nice, like, you know? And so I think that it's one of those things that if you can be in, like Mel said, if you can be intentional, I think one of those ways to be intentional is to maybe even move it off of your campus and figure out a way to reach the community that it's around.
Well, the problem with that though, is that pastors, we still have to get to the place where it's not about getting people in our building and getting people at our church on a Sunday morning, you know? And so I think that's one of the things, one of the reasons that we're resistant to that still, because we go, no, we'll serve, but we're going to serve them here. You know what I mean? Like we'll do an Easter egg hunt, but it's got to be on our property or, you know, and I think we have to get past that and go, hey, I just want to serve our community and I'm going to let God deal with the increase. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons pastors, at least pastors I know, struggle with that to some degree. And I know some people might be listening to this going, well, yeah, that's great. I don't have that much space. Like, and that's for us, there's things we've talked about doing that it's like, we just don't have the room to do it. We can't open a gym in our facility because we don't have the space to. And so the cool thing is if you're like us, there might be some things you could do that doesn't require you building on or, you know, doing a renovation. Like we host the CPS, then when they do their foster training, you know, we open up our building for them to do that. That's on the first Monday of the month, I think. And, you know, so there's some things like that we do, that we open up our doors to the community to go, hey, come use our building, come be a part, you know, we'll be a resource for you. So even if you don't have the ability to open up a coffee shop, you could probably host a meeting of, you know, the Chamber of Commerce or, you know, so if we just start looking at our church beyond, you know, Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights and, you know, traditional meeting times, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah. Do you think that we, in the age of modern transportation and the online world, that the city center is just kind of like an obsolete idea now? So when you think about like older towns and cities, I believe it's the case that the church steeple was a thing because legally the church had to be the tallest building in the zone. Like it had to be the tallest so that people could see where it was. And I think the idea was that it kind of functioned as like the heart of the town or the heart of the city. Might be wrong about that, but I don't think I am. And so then you think like going all the way back to like ziggurats and things like that. If you go way back, you have these places that are like the center of the city. Do you think that our technology and our ability to move ourselves around so easily and efficiently has just decentralized things to where like the city center is not as valuable as it used to be?
I think to some degree from a social perspective, a sociological perspective, I think that's probably the case. But and maybe I'm just old fashioned. I keep coming back to this idea that the church is about gathering. Fundamentally, it's about coming together. It's about sharing the gospel. It's about mobilizing people. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to engage in authentic relationship online. You can be in relationship with people online, but it's so much easier to do that in person. I just don't know how you translate that virtually. And so in terms of a culture or a town, yeah, I could see decentralizing for sure. When you can order your groceries online, and I mean, I bought a car online. You know what I mean? Like it's in 2 states away. It's being shipped to me. Like I don't even have to go car shopping, right? And so everything is virtual now. We can do everything online. I just think relationship is something it's really hard to do well online. And I think people long for intimacy. So I think there's some things that we're going to make virtual, and there's some things I think are real hard to make virtual.
Yeah, I think it depends too. So the need hasn't gone away. No, the need is still there because that's a, like you said, sociological need for community in general. But I think that it also depends on where you live as far as like has the city center crumbled or gone away, because the smaller of a town you live in, the more likely it is that you still have some sort of city center gathering.
Town square.
But yeah, exactly. Yeah. But as you break off into the city, it's not so much the case. Like I think about here, like I grew up in the DFW Metroplex in Texas, which is just massive. It's like one big, huge, sprawling city. And they're like, even within the smaller communities, there's not a city center. There's not a place where everybody goes and this is where we hang out. And like, even though there's downtowns and all that, it just doesn't happen. But coming here to Indiana, I've noticed that there is more of that. There is more of that tighter knit community because it's a smaller community. Like with all the parades, like man, I've never been in a town that has so many parades, and and everybody goes to them too. Like we went to the Veterans Day parade, which was almost nothing, but there were still people there just hanging out.
Watching people walk down the street.
Watching people walk down the street with a flag. I was like, what is going on? And my kids love it too. Yeah. Like, I'm like, what do y'all even like this? So anyways, I think it depends on where you live too. Yeah. And so as we are in the context of rural pastors and rural church communities, I think it's a little easier to answer that question with, the need is still there and there's still a great opportunity for that. But I think the further you move out into the cities, it makes it more difficult. And that's why you're seeing a lot of the churches that are from bigger cities, that are from bigger communities, they're actually having not only a church online platform, but they're actually doing their small groups online. They have a church online community that they actually have church online pastors, or they're building whole studios to basically only worry about who's online. And so, I think that the city center for larger communities has actually moved online, and it's difficult. I don't think it's impossible, but it is difficult. And, we're not talking about this right now, but that's where I think the church has to figure out at some point, is that we still have the need for gathering, but if the only way to gather is online, or the most prevalent way to gather is online, especially as we grow, how do we do that well? So
some of the higher production churches that I've been in, because of what they're trying to do on the weekend, would also make the best movie theaters like in the area. I mean, because you have a big screen at home, like in a living room. Most people in their living rooms have something approximating like a big screen that you'd find at like a movie theater. Maybe they even have surround sound. They don't have an LED wall at home though. And like, do you think that would you screen movies that are like hot movies, like movies that people are wanting to watch, just to get people in the building, to get them to see, like, so you might have somebody who's like, well, I'm not going to church, period, for any reason. But if it's like, say like a new Die Hard movie comes out, it might not be a good
It's Christmas time, Die Hard. Yeah.
Well.
Christmas, yeah.
And they're like, well, I don't want to go to church, but I really want to see that movie, and I can't see it at a theater that matches the equipment of this church. And then so they go in and they're like, wow, that was pretty great. I'd never been inside of a church. That didn't feel anything like a church. Maybe the weekend service is something I'd enjoy too. Like, do you see that as a viable outreach, even if you're screening movies that are like, not Christian movies?
Okay, so I'll take this one. We've done family movie nights here at the church as a service for our community, because there are a number of people in our community that are lower income, that if they've got multiple kids, it's expensive to go to a movie. And so we would offer a family movie night just as a service to go, hey, bring your kids, it's free, bring your drinks, bring your candy, whatever. But we probably would hold off on any like John McClane, yippee-ki-yay, kind of movies.
Those are holy speakers, Michael.
That's right. Just because, I tell our staff, like, we have enough problems, don't create your own problems. And it feels like if we did some of that, it might be creating our own problems. So I would do a family movie night. And after we saw several churches in our community did it too. And that's a good thing. I think that's valuable. But the intention wasn't maybe they'll come back to church. It was purely like, let's just offer a service to our community. But I could see a certain kind of church saying, yes, that would be valuable to do. We probably wouldn't do that specifically that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it'd be an awesome thing to do. I also agree with you that creates so many problems. And again, I think it goes back to what community are you in? What is the makeup of your church? What is the community that you are trying to reach? Who are you trying to reach? Who are you actually reaching? Who is already in your building? Because that would all be factors into, because there might even be some family movies that people are like, no, that's wrong. Yeah. That's an allegory for, a coming out story or whatever. And I don't want my kids to watch that. And it's like, maybe, so you could even create problems there. So yeah, I think it would be an awesome thing to do. I also agree that you got to be careful with what you show.
The only movies you can show have to be starring, what's his name? Kirk Cameron. Kevin Sorbo, or
you can only show God's Not Dead 1, 2, and 12.
That's right.
That's all you can do.
Right. Those are the only movies.
Oh man. Okay. So what about non-religious speakers? So think of people who maybe like speak in terms of the same theme of values, like a Ben Shapiro or Ben Shapiro's religious, but like a Jordan Peterson, or people who maybe like the message of what they're saying is in line with what is taught at the church, but they're not overtly Christian. Would you host people like that or platform people like that as a way of, as a means of outreach, or even just as a way of like, if somebody wants to come speak in Indiana, it's hard to find a venue as well equipped as Summit Church. Like it just is. And so like, would you open that up for speakers who maybe they don't see things completely eye to eye on all the things that you do? Do you think that it would be wise for a church to invite that kind of content into their building?
Yeah. I've known a couple of churches that have done this, not personally, but I've heard of a couple of churches who have done this kind of thing. For instance, it's a very large church, and they're in LA, so that, again, the community that they're in. But Mosaic Church with Erwin McManus, he actually was talking recently about how he got an opportunity to interview Ben Affleck at his church. And he was told not to ask any questions about religion or anything like that. Like, it was literally just a PR thing for Ben Affleck. But because of the conversation that was happening, Ben actually is the one who opened up to Erwin and started talking about his growing up Catholic. And that got into a conversation just about the gospel in general from Erwin's perspective. And so I thought that was a really cool thing. Like, man, that's really neat. And I don't know, most churches would probably say, oh, heck no. Ben Affleck, like, absolutely not. We can't allow him in here. But because they're reaching actors, actresses, creatives in that town, in that city, it's perfect for them. And so I think, again, it just depends. I think it's a great idea depending on, how much you can control, essentially, of what's actually being said and what's going on. And again, who you are trying to reach.
Yeah, I think I would be pretty excited about having Batman come to our church.
Yeah.
Batman goes to my church. So I probably wouldn't just hand him a mic and let him speak. Hey, you got 35 minutes, go. But in the context of an interview, I would have somebody who's not a believer. As long as I had a good feel for, okay, here's the direction we're going. And, I would have a conversation with a non-believer in the right context, so I would be open to that. As far as just having an event here, like if somebody, a political speaker, whether right or left, wanted to have an event here, I would be a little more hesitant about that. Again, if I was going to interview them, that's one thing, because we've talked about during election season bringing in Republican and Democrat candidates, and letting me just interview them and just have conversations. And I would be open to that, where we're not picking sides and we're not saying, hey, we're all going to vote. We all know who to vote for. Wink, wink, but just have conversations. And I think that can be valuable. But in terms of, hey, on a Thursday night, we're going to sell tickets for whoever, to come in and speak. That's where I'm like, oh, I don't want it to look like we're picking sides, because I want to continue to be able to reach people who don't agree with this person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the political side of it, Mel, because there's a second layer to this question, and it is that, so imagine like the church starts the university becomes like a center for a diversity of thought. They're not increasingly, universities are stepping away from that philosophy of free exchange of ideas. And so do you think the church needs to come in behind that and take up that mantle? And I'm not super sharp on my church history when it comes to the birthing of the university, and I don't know if it was like the intent of the church to form the place of the free exchange of ideas. If it was, isn't it the church's responsibility to take that mantle up again, since the universities have departed from that? And if it is, should the church risk maybe platforming somebody that has a message that's not ideal, just out of principle for the freedom of expression or the freedom of thought? Should we have faith, in other words, that the truth will out, the truth will stand, even if a person comes forward, like I'm cautious about crafting a society wherein there is no place for that kind of thing, where all of the avenues for freedom of speech and freedom of expression are gone. And if the university's not doing it, who's going to do it?
I think you put a lot more faith in the common man than I do. I've had too many conversations lately where people just ask me point blank who I voted for in the last election. Like, they care more about that than doctrine, Yeah. And so I feel like, yes, that is ideally, that'd be great. I don't know that I would ever, again, platform somebody where I just hand them a mic and say, you got 40 minutes to, talk about whatever you want, go. But I could see on our platform having a conversation with somebody who is pro-choice, and being able to walk through that and have a dialogue together. We're decidedly pro-life, right? But let's walk through this together and let's just talk about this. And we don't have to hate each other, and I don't have to beat you up metaphorically or physically, right? So I think that does have value. But I think for a lot of people, politics is the new religion.
I think, you said that he has more faith in the common man. And I think that's part of it, is that it's ideal. It'd be great. But the problem is even if you had someone come in and you interviewed them, and for your example, that was pro-choice, you would have people sitting in the congregation like just seething, like just, I cannot believe this is happening, and how dare, and I cannot wait to write this email, and I'm going to tell them what's on my mind. And that's because we've created a society, and we've created a culture, whether in church or outside of the church, where we just need to tweet and or type our thoughts and just, send it out. And then we're just going to argue back and forth, and nothing's ever going to change. And there is no exchange of free thought. Like, the exchange, I would say, would be like, I'm going to actually take something you said and chew on it. There is not exchange. There is shouting of free thought. There is, we take a bullhorn and we just shout what we think, and we don't respond to the person who said something else that might, challenge our narrative or our reality. And so, in an ideal world, that would be awesome if the church could be a place where we could exchange free thought, and again, be forgiving and loving and caring and have compassion.
Good faith conversations.
Yeah, and actually have real conversations. But the problem is that, and this goes back to the thing we opened up with, is that people are people, and they are completely broken. Yeah. And we live in a broken society and a broken culture that social media has perpetuated the inability to have good conversations. And so ideally, it'd be awesome. But currently, it'd be really stinking difficult.
Really challenging.
Yeah. Wow. You both have done an excellent job of describing the depressing, both the very depressing and very accurate nature of the situation, and that it is the case, that in order to have the right, essentially, to freedom of expression in a place where free speech can happen and exchange of ideas can happen, you have to have individuals who are responsible enough to do that. And so the problem then might not be the university administration. It might just be like the fact that individuals can't handle that kind of conversation anymore. They've slipped so far away from that they're, like Kendall, like you said, and Mel, like you said, like even if we open it up for that kind of thing, it's just going to devolve into a shouting match based on whatever their a priori presuppositions were when they came in the door.
Well, and, I said earlier that Disney lied to us, but I mean, I think we really do in Western culture have this idea that, there is one objective truth, and that objective truth is whatever I believe, and that the goal is to be happy, and the goal is to, that everything's right and everything's in alignment, and whenever somebody comes with a dissonant thought or idea, it is messing with my happiness and you're meddling with my story now. Mm-hmm. And so there's no place to go, hey, maybe the prince and the princess don't end up together at the end. Maybe my life won't be perfect, and how do we reconcile these things? And I think fundamentally, like, we approach all these things with the wrong mindset, and we tend to think it's about us. And it's like, well, no, what if we have these conversations more open-handedly and just go, okay, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I might be wrong about this. But we just don't tend to have those conversations like that. And even in the church for the most part.
Yeah, I think within the church, it comes with, if you challenge what I believe, there's a fear that I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. And that fear that I'm wrong outweighs the possibility that I might be wrong, and I'm going to open up for the conversation. Because if I'm wrong, then that could challenge every foundation that I have.
Yeah,
and what else is going to, what else is going to crumble? And, it's an immature way of thinking. It's a way that kids argue. It's a way that I think about my kids one time. I live near Mel, and, I don't know that he heard this, but he saw the video. Both of my kids one day were arguing that they were unicorns, that unicorns were real. And my son was arguing that they were, which was odd. And then my daughter was arguing that they weren't. And they were just yelling at each other. Yes, they are. No, they're not. And there's no argument actually to be had. Just one believes one way, one believes the other way, and they are angry about it because of what they want to believe in. And when I see them argue that way, it's a perfect picture of what we do in society, is that we're just going to yell back and forth, and I'm not going to address the argument you made. You're not going to address the argument I made. We're just going to yell back and forth, and we're both going to go our separate ways and continue to believe the exact same thing we believed in the first place, and then not like each other. So,
yeah, wow.
Well, and that's why I've got people in our church that want me to be more political, and it's like, but man, that's not central. Like, I keep coming back to the centrality of the gospel. Like, the gospel should cut through all this stuff. The gospel is, Christ is preeminent above all these political issues. But, if we don't recognize that, then it doesn't matter. If my political issues in my heart and mind are still preeminent, if my ideologies, all those kind of things, it's not that Christ is robbed of power, but we just don't recognize his power. We're not submitted to his power. And that's where I keep coming back to. The gospel is everything. Jesus is everything. Let's get that right. And if we get that right, then everything else will start to fall into place. But we flip it and get it backwards.
Yeah. This has been really good. Ladies and gentlemen, Mel Massengale, Kendall Kersey. Before you go, don't forget to rate and review this podcast and share it wherever you're listening to it or watching it. Thank you all for joining the Back40 Leadership Podcast, and we will see you in the next episode.